Welcome to the Researching Practice, Introducing the Theory of Practice Architectures vodcast. My name is Máirín Glenn, and I'm here today with the originator of the theory of practice architectures, Stephen Kemmis. This is episode 8 of this series of vodcasts, and it is entitled Changing Practices. So, Stephen, over to you.
So here we are, changing practices. Last time we were talking about how practices were connected up with one another, and we were talking about ecologies of practices. If you want to change one, you have to change more of them. So we're getting this idea of practices being a species that is going to change. But I'm going to talk more about changing practices in a couple of different ways over this and the next session. In the 1840s, Karl Marx made a kind of breakthrough for social theory. And in the page and a half of the thesis on Feuerbach, part of thesis 3 reads, the materialist doctrine that people are products of circumstances and upbringing, and that therefore changed people are products of changed circumstances and changed upbringing, forgets that it is people who change circumstances and that educators must themselves be educated. Now, this is a kind of breakthrough because he's talking about practice, and he's talking about practice in a very grounded way. He calls it sensuous human activity. And he's seeing how practices are made by people. They're not just the products of circumstances. And he ends up with the famous thesis 11. Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And really, after he's done these theses on Feuerbach, that's the end of his philosophical work. I mean, he does philosophical work, but he goes on to be mostly doing political theory after that. So, changing practices requires changing the practice architectures that hold them in place. But changing practice architectures requires changing the arrangements that compose them, and people can change some, but not all of those arrangements. Most teachers can't rebuild the school while they're working in it, although you can change things around in the classroom, perhaps.
Sorry, Stephen, to cut across you. Just that whole thing about changing practice requires changing the practice architectures that hold them in place. Is that problematic, I wonder, for people who are, say, researching their own practice, the teacher who's researching her own practice in her own classroom, along obviously with her students and fellow teachers or whoever she's doing her research with? I can understand how she can change her own practice, but changing the practice architectures might be a bit of a challenge, would it not?
It depends what you think practice architectures are. If you think of them only in bricks and mortar kind of terms, they might be hard to change. But I hope we'll see that the things that actually compose practice architectures are things that can be changed. Let me go on a slide or two and we'll see whether this, bring me back if I'm not answering the question.
Okay, you can convince me.
I might have to wait till next session to convince you, because
okay.
one of the things that I'm going to talk about now for a bit is learning. A lot of people think you change practices by people learning, and it's all about people learning. This is another one of those elements where the whole culture makes us believe in the sort of sovereignty of the individual. Society is made up of these individual atoms called people, and if you see society through that picture, you remember Margaret Thatcher once famously said, "There is no such thing as society. There are only people." And so she thinks it's everybody acting in the correct way. So I want to say learning is important, but changing practices requires more than individual people learning. My friend and a source of immense inspiration for all of my work, Theodore Schatzky, once wrote that practice theory can accept the conventional definition of learning as the acquisition of knowledge. And I came to realize that I didn't think so, and I was going to have to talk to Ted about that. And so I wrote an article about it and corresponded with him about drafts, and a whole lot of our correspondence is in the footnotes of the article. My view, and the view of Christine Edwards Groves, is that all knowledge, Ted's talking about learning as the acquisition of knowledge, arises from, represents, recalls, anticipates, and returns to its use in practices. Knowledge doesn't just get in the head, it is grounded in our practices. Even if they're entirely artificial practices in the classroom and they're only used in the classroom, that knowledge is grounded in the practice of the classroom. But the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein thought that practice was so important that it was the rough ground to which we should always return. We should look in practice. And so his understanding of knowledge and meaning was deeply grounded in a practice view about where knowledge comes from and where it goes to. So it's not just what's in our heads. I think this knowledge is literally embodied in the whole of our bodies. It's not just something that resides between our ears. So the view that I proposed against Ted's view is that learning is a process of coming to practice differently. So how do you get people to practice differently? Not just by telling them things, but by involving them in different sorts of activities and by getting them to participate differently in relationships with other people and the world. And another way of saying it is learning is what happens when practices are reproduced with variation or transformed, when new practices are produced from precursor practices. And my developmental psychology training from thousands of years ago, well, many years ago, certainly led me to think that all of the sophisticated practices of expert adults have come from the sucking and grasping and head turning of infants. And all of our practices are modification of those repertoires to become, highly complicated things that, doing philosophy or performing neurosurgery or designing a website. So in the next session, I'm going to talk more about how changing practices requires changing practice architectures. But I'm trying to emphasize, or I've tried to emphasize through this, that it's not just changing the one who practices. I think I said W.B. Yeats all that time ago, how shall we know the dancer from the dance? Take your eyes off the actor, the one who's doing the practicing, and look at the dance. What are they doing? And how on earth do they come to be doing that? Where did that come from? The answer to that question, men make history, but they do not make it under self-chosen circumstances, not just as they please. They make it under circumstances given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations lies like a nightmare on the brains of the living. So how do we change the practice architectures that will allow us those circumstances? How do we change those circumstances? that will allow us to practice differently.
Yes. And that question is still dangling for me about
It
changing
will, and
practice architectures. However, I am
I'm
very aware of, in our last episode, in episode 7, that wonderful example from the school where the children were practicing inclusion in their own conversations, and which it was a habit that had come from the staff and the people who worked in the school. Yeah, I'm still not 100% happy that I can see how one individual can actually change the practice architectures that hold the practice in place. I'm waiting to be convinced.
well, I'll have to have another try when we meet next time, Maureen.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Stephen, for helping us understand how we might use the theory of practice architectures to understand how we might change practices. Thank you for joining us in episode 8 of Researching Practice, Introducing the Theory of Practice Architectures podcast with Stephen Kemmis and me, Máirín Glenn. The next episode is episode 9, and it is about action research and the theory of practice architectures. You may access these podcasts via YouTube on the link below, or at stephenkemmis.com or at eari.ie. Looking forward to seeing you the next time. Bye from me.
And from me. See you next time.